So let's look at these issues. First of all, issue number 1, the avoidance of grains and legumes. So the paleo rationale for eliminating grains and legumes include the following. They say they were not a part of our ancestral diets. They say they're high in harmful antinutrients, especially phytates and lectins. And they say they cause inflammation and disease. So let's take a quick peek at those claims. So were grains and legumes truly not a part of our ancestral diets? Well, actually, there's quite strong evidence that grains and legumes played key roles in pre-agricultural diets. So we have some, I'll just give you a little flavor of some of the studies we have. We have studies on Neanderthals showing that they ate wild legumes, peas and fava beans, and grains. We have studies showing the Aikung San of the Kalahari relied on the sin bean as a dietary staple. Only the mongongo fruit they consumed in greater quantity. We have studies showing legumes were the main energy source in the spring for the Middle Paleolithic humans in Mount Carmel, Israel. We have studies on Middle Stone Age, with looking at Middle Stone Age tool from Mozambique that showed Homo sapiens relying on grass seeds. So these are just a few of the studies that we have showing that our ancestors did rely on legumes and grains. Now there's another group from the University of Sydney, and I actually just printed this out before coming, the quarterly review of biology, and if you can read the small letters under there, it says the importance of dietary carbohydrates in human evolution. And what they suggested is that Paleolithic humans would not have evolved on today's paleo diet. They said that cooking starchy food was central to the dietary change that triggered and sustained the growth of the human brain. And so very interesting research by this particular group. But even so, even if our ancestors didn't eat grains and legumes, should omission in Paleolithic times mean exclusion today? And I would argue that excluding foods because of their alleged absence in Paleolithic diets defies rationality. Grains and legumes stand out as exceptional food sources for a growing human population when we consider the health, economic, ethical, and environmental attributes of these foods. So the next claim is that these foods are high in anti-nutrients. And I just cut these little pictures off of the internet, and you can see, is quinoa paleo, grains equal leaky gut, say goodbye to grains and gluten, let go of legumes, why we should say no to beans. And this is the mantra of the Paleolithic movement. And I took this off of Dr. Ben Balsner's Paleolithic Diet weblog. And here's what he says about anti-nutrients. He says, anti-nutrients are toxins. The vast majority and highest levels of anti-nutrients are in Neolithic foods like grains, beans, and potatoes. The Paleolithic diet has incredibly low levels of anti-nutrients compared to the usual modern diet. I believe that this is the number one advantage of this diet. So he's saying this is why, because of the anti-nutrients in plants, this is why people should eat paleo. So what are anti-nutrients? Well, anti-nutrients are compounds like lectins and phytates, these are the two examples most commonly used, that actually interfere with the absorption of nutrients or are toxic at high levels. The highest levels of anti-nutrients are in plant foods, especially legumes and grains. So why are they in plants? Well, anti-nutrients are necessary for the propagation and survival of plants. They have two main actions. Number one, to ensure that nutrients are not released prematurely, because they need to be used by the plant slowly as it's growing. Number two, to serve as a chemical defense system against predators. So to protect the plants. That's why they're there. So let's take a look at lectins and phytates just briefly. So first, lectins. So what are lectins? Well, lectins are a type of sort of carbohydrate binding protein. So they can bind to both carbohydrates and to cell membranes. So they're a type of protein. They can agglutinate red blood cells, which means they can cause red blood cells to stick together and make us quite sick in doing so. They're most concentrated in legumes and in grains. The paleo perspective, they say that impaired intestinal integrity produced by dietary lectins may cause low-level inflammation in our bloodstreams, and this is a necessary step for atherosclerosis and cancer. So they're basically blaming atherosclerosis and cancer on these anti-nutrients. They also go on to say that they may look like cells in your brain, pancreas, etc. So the same antibodies that were created to attack lectin will actually go launch attacks on your own body. And that's the cause of autoimmune disease. So they're saying, type 1 diabetes, celiac disease, lupus, MS are all, this is all a part of causing these diseases. So let's take a look at what science says. Well, what science says is that some lectins are very damaging. They can cause severe adverse food reactions like food poisoning, and they can damage the lining of the small intestine and interfere with nutrient transport. Others are actually very health promoting. They decrease the incidence of disease, they help the body with inflammatory modulation, decreasing inflammation, and they have actually quite powerful anti-tumor activity. And there are just dozens of studies going on looking at specific lectins and even using them to treat cancer. So there's a lot of research in this area. But the bottom line is intakes of lectins are rarely high enough to threaten health. And the reason is that the damaging lectins are lectins that we cook out of foods before we eat them. So, and the studies suggesting adverse effects are predominantly on animals that are fed raw legumes. Humans cook legumes, and conventional cooking practices completely destroys lectins. So for example, red kidney beans. If you don't soak them, you need to cook them for at least an hour. At a high enough temperature, bring them to a boil and boil them for about an hour. If they're soaked overnight, 10 to 15 minutes will kill all the lectins, like 100% gone. So we just need to be aware of that. Germination and fermentation can reduce lectins by 75 to 100%, depending on how long we ferment and how long we sprout. So, red kidney beans, probably not a good plan to eat them raw sprouted, because there's still lectins that are very dangerous lectins that would remain. Now, I came across this quote, and I thought it was interesting because I don't know if you've heard of Kresser, but he's a paleo advocate. He wrote Your Personal Paleo Code, and he's quite astute. He's really quite a bright guy. But this is what he said about legumes. He said, "To my knowledge, there's only one study demonstrating humans being harmed by consuming legumes. This study is often used by paleo advocates to prove that legumes are dangerous. However, what is often neglected is that this study described a case of food poisoning that occurred in hospital patients who ate legumes that hadn't been cooked properly." Now, he's wrong. There are dozens of studies that show this. As a matter of fact, there was one in 2015, I believe, from Japan, where somebody started this weight loss craze where they were recommending that you toast white kidney beans for 3 minutes on a frying pan, then grind them up in a blender to a powder and sprinkle the powder on your rice, and thousands of people got violently ill. It was a nightmare. And so we do have other reports of people consuming raw legumes with these very toxic lectins. So that's a lesson. We know we need to cook large legumes. But to me, the acid test, and I've said this before, the acid test is to examine the diets of the longest lived, healthiest people on the planet. the people of the blue zones. And of course, you recall the 5 blue zones: Okinawa, Sardinia, Loma Linda, Ikaria, Greece, and the Nicoya Peninsula of Costa Rica. And the lifestyle patterns that are common to all of them are the family, the not smoking, socially engaged, the physical activity. They all eat plant-based diets, and they all eat legumes. If the lectins in legumes were so poisonous, these people wouldn't be the healthiest, longest-lived people on the planet. They're their main dietary staples for all of them. So I think that's just a really important thing to remember. And we have a study that I just thought was amazing. They found legumes to be the most important dietary predictor of survival in older people of different ethnicities. And when food intake patterns of people 70 years plus from a variety of cultures were examined, the only statistically significant food indicator of longevity was legume intake. For every 2/3 of an ounce, or 20 grams, of legumes consumed, there was a 7 to 8% reduction in mortality. You do the math. How much reduction in mortality would you get if you actually ate a whole cup? Yeah, you'd live forever. So, we know there are so many benefits of beans. Legumes have been associated with improved gut microflora. They're one of our most powerful prebiotics. They reduce risk of diabetes, metabolic syndrome, heart disease, and some forms of cancer. Why? Because they're our richest source of dietary fiber. They have very low glycemic index. They're nutrient dense. They have a lot of protein, iron, zinc, potassium, magnesium, and folate. They're high in phytochemicals and antioxidants. They're high in plant sterols. And they're very low in fat, and particularly low in saturated fat, with the exception of soybeans and peanuts, which are a legume as well, which are a little higher in fat. So what about phytates? Well, phytates, first of all, what are phytates? Phytates are phytic acid bound to minerals in plant food. So it's really the stored form of phosphorus in foods. So they're bound to calcium, iron, magnesium. And the richest sources of phytates are whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds. We get smaller amounts in roots and other vegetables. And the richest source by far is bran, like wheat bran and rice bran are particularly concentrated. So as a vegetarian or a vegan, one thing you do not want to do is sprinkle wheat bran on your food. Remember people who are, sprinkle wheat bran to help with constipation and stuff? Vegetarians get enough fiber. You don't want to put a phytate bomb on your food. You already reduce about 50% less zinc than a non-vegetarian would, so you need to do what you can to maximize absorption of those minerals. You don't want to be sprinkling phytate bombs on, but it doesn't mean that you can't have some phytates in your food. The paleo perspective, here's what they say about phytates. Beans and legumes, unlike nuts and seeds, are the primary source of calories for many people around the world, and eating foods that's so rich in phytic acid as a nutritional staple is quite unhealthy. Basing your diet on these foods can lead to severe nutritional deficiencies. This is ridiculous, but anyway, here's what science says. Phytates can impair mineral absorption. However, we reduce phytates when we soak, sprout, ferment, blend, juice, roast, yeast, like raising of breads, or expose foods to acid like lemon juice or vinegar. So there are a lot of things that reduce phytates, but here's what's really interesting. People eating largely plant-based have intestinal bacteria that are more capable of breaking down phytate mineral complexes than omnivores. So our bodies adjust to a little bit higher load of phytates. But here's the other thing. A growing body of evidence suggests that phytates have multiple potential beneficial actions. They're strong antioxidants. They help to repair DNA. They protect against amyloid plaque formation. Where have you heard that before? Amyloid plaque formation is associated with dementia, like Alzheimer's. They lower cholesterol and triglycerides. They inhibit tumor growth. They improve glycemic response. They inhibit bone loss. And they reduce kidney stone formation. So maybe we want a few phytates in our diet. You know, what's really interesting is legumes and grains are not the only sources of lectins and phytates. Many paleo-approved foods, including nuts, seeds, vegetables, fruits, berries, spices, are also significant sources. And if you look at this list, what you can see is the things in pink are paleo-forbidden. The things in green are paleo-approved. And so they approve some of the things that are actually at the very top of the list of phytate foods. Even higher than wheat bran is spinach, and they eat plenty of spinach. Sesame seeds, almonds, walnuts, pecans. So they do eat phytates. So they have a little bit of a selective exclusion there. And then finally, do grains actually cause inflammation? Well, absolutely, if you have celiac disease or a grain intolerance. Otherwise, the evidence suggests that whole grains reduce inflammation and refined grains increase inflammation. That's what we know.